another 1952-style blowout. But then the preacher's son came alive. Francis Tarkenton started the black and red going with what would become, for the Bulldogs, their signature, the second-half surge. Tarkenton completed a series of passes to the Florida 7. Then, facing a critical 4th and goal from the 4, Tarkenton scrambled back to the 26 under heavy rush and dodged frustrated would-be tacklers all the way to the end zone. Another drive produced a touchdown that brought the Dogs within 8 and a chance to tie. But Tarkenton's final drive stalled on the Florida 39, and the Gators survived to give Coach Graves a significant win.
On that first year, we were chasing Grant Tarkenton all over the field, which a lot of people in the NFL chased him for years too. But it was, I think, a pattern that we really felt was good for the program to be able to beat Georgia and Jacksonville.
We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon.
As the 1960s unfolded, the country had a new president and a spirit of renewed idealism. President Kennedy promised the moon in a decade. Meanwhile, Georgia football faced a challenge of its own, stopping the Florida juggernaut.
I had read in the paper that
Dog fans that neither school has been able to shed.
I didn't really realize exactly what it was. I had read in the paper that it was called the world's greatest cocktail party, and I had no idea what it was like.
The passion the two schools shared on the field was being equaled each year by their boisterous fans, who arrived earlier and earlier in ever-increasing numbers, consuming ever more food and drink.
The Jacksonville experience itself is something to behold. I really wish everyone could go and see a game for a weekend. The campers start arriving midweek and park all along next to the stadium down by the river.
The students were everywhere, all down the roads. It was thousands and thousands of people. You'd think it was game day already the day before. There were so many people there.
Back in the times in the 60s when I played, everybody was getting excited about going to Jacksonville. Students, but at that time, we cut class.
In fact, some of the high schools had taken Fridays off, but Georgia just shuts down.
Yeah, having so much fun. We were rooting for them. And sooner or later, you may have somebody that wearing a Florida shirt, wearing a Georgia hat.
Everyone dresses in their team colors, and from downtown to the most fancy office in town, they'll be wearing their red and black or their orange and blue.
Jacksonville's population would swell by the thousands for each meeting of this fall classic. The city reaped revenues estimated between $12 and $14 million from the mayhem of game week. Today, those dollar estimates have more than tripled. In 1964, a 32-year-old former Auburn quarterback, Vince Dooley, arrived in Athens to pull the Bulldogs out of the SEC cellar.
Vince Dooley was certainly one of the great coaches of all time, and I would say it was always a challenge to play against a Vince Dooley team.
I liked the man for years until I mean, I did not like Coach Dooley for years. I mean, just because he was the Georgia coach.
He always had his team well prepared. They were so well prepared that we really couldn't do anything offensively against them.
Coach Dooley just did something with us that we believed no matter what, we were going to win. And for the most cases, we did win all the games down there.
When I got inducted into the College Hall of Fame, I told Coach, I didn't like you. I thought you were real hard. I was a good student. Never missed class. I did everything. Never got in trouble. But he was really, real tough. And I said, but I love you today because you were just like my mother and father.
When it came time to pack the bags for Jacksonville in 1964, Dooley's Bulldogs were 10-point underdogs to Ray Graves' ninth-ranked Gators. Florida's loaded offense was led by fullback Larry Dupree and a promising sophomore quarterback, Steve Spurrier. Heading into the game, the Gators were 5-1, nationally ranked, and a bold certainty. The first half belonged to Florida with a 181-yard output on offense, capped by a 7-yard TD run by Larry Dupree. Spurrier ran the offense well, but the Gators had a hard time getting into the end zone. At intermission, Florida held on to a slim 7-0 lead. In the second half, Georgia came to life on Florida fumbles and miscues. Halfback Fred Barber's 2-yard dive into the end zone cut the Gator lead to 1. Bobby Etter's extra point tied the game at 7 with 13 minutes left to play. The unassuming Etter was about to walk into Georgia-Florida rivalry history on that Saturday in November. The Bulldogs regained possession of yet another Florida fumble at the Gator 21. They drove to the 5-yard line where they faced a 4th and 4. Georgia, which had 0 passing yardage all day, could seal the upset with a field goal, and duly went to Bobby Etter for the short kick and the win.
But it was a bad snap from Summer, but Bobby Etter picked it up and ran to the left. It's a play we rehearsed in practice. And Barry Wilson ran ahead of him. Then the side back ran up and was going to tackle him at the goal line. But Barry Wilson hit him head on with a good block. But it required Etter to dive over for the winning touchdown. So we had to settle for touchdown instead of kicking the winning field goal.
We didn't have containment coming around the corner over there. You know, maybe they'd beat us on another play later on. We had our chances in that game, but just didn't do it.
It was a heartbreaking loss for the Gators, but in Steve Spurrier, they had found their lead character for the annual Florida-Georgia drama for the next 2 years. A tenacious talent who would turn up the intensity of the long-standing rivalry.
From then on, you can start going through just a whole litany of football games, many of which were different, unique, that came down to the wire, and a lot of great memories, a lot of not so good memories.
We were 7-0, Steve Spurrier senior year, and we were the highest rank that Florida had ever been.
Spurrier had his team.
And only once in 3 tries in Jacksonville. The 1965 thriller that will long be remembered by the sold-out Gator Bowl crowd. With Florida out front first, Georgia staged a second-half resurgence with a 64-yard drive and touchdown strike from Kirby Moore to Pat Hodgson. Then Steve Spurrier took matters into his own hands.
They hit Charlie Casey on a little curl route, and they sort of got out of position and sort of caught it on the run and went down the sideline to about the old 15-20-yard line. And then I threw Jack Harper a pass going down the sideline where the safety was running over to knock it down or maybe even intercept. He stepped in a hole and fell on his face. Lynn Hughes he's a buddy of mine now. So we ended up winning that one 14-10. But I certainly would have swapped that one for the one the next year because the conference championship was on the line the next year when they beat us soundly.
The 1966 contest was a game for the ages and a benchmark for both teams.
We were 7-0, Steve Spurrier senior year, and we were the highest rank that Florida had ever been.
Spurrier had his team in contention for the Southeastern Conference Championship, even the National Championship, and he led the Gators to a touchdown on the opening kickoff, 86 yards.
Spurrier directed a picture-perfect drive with key passes to Richard Trapp, Larry Smith, and Jack Coons. Fullback Fred McKeel's 1-yard smash put the Gators on top early. But the Dogs came roaring back ferociously, not with points, but with defense. Led by future All-American tackle Bill Stanfill, the Georgia front wall contained the Florida offense, limiting the high-powered Gators to just 10 points.
He had been in bed with the flu all week and they said he didn't think he would play. And he sacked Steve Spurrier about 4 or 5 times, and after the game I said, well, I'm glad that Stanfill wasn't feeling too well and was under the weather, but I said if he'd been healthy, he might have killed Steve and put him in prison.
I didn't know he was hurt. He certainly didn't play like he was hurt. Now, he had a big game also. They stormed the gates on us.
Stormed the gates and stole the treasure. The nation's leading passer was intercepted downfield and mauled in the backfield, and it put a spark in the Georgia offense.
We just got our butts beat. I mean, we got beat bad. In fact, Steve was actually drawing plays in the dirt on the field at the end of the game, trying to get some plays that will work.
We had sort of a scheme of offense that if the linebackers blitz and we had a drop back pass, the backs would sort of go out and hook up where they came from. And so Georgia, they just played the safety man right there. They smothered the line of scrimmage on us.
Vince Dooley had devised a defensive plan that effectively hindered Spurrier's game. Tied at 10 in the fourth quarter with only 10 minutes to play, the Bulldog defense once again pulled the plug on Spurrier. Defensive back Lynn Hughes picked off a pass and sprinted to the end zone, and Georgia never looked back. For Lynn Hughes, it was redemption. Hughes was the man who'd been beaten by Jack Harper and Spurrier in 1965 on the game-winning pass. Georgia added more fuel to the fire with another touchdown before the final gun. It was a stunning 27-10 upset. Bulldog fans rejoiced at beating the outstanding Gator quarterback, and Florida fans watched another SEC title slip away. A crowning moment for Vince Dooley, a bitter pill for Steve Spurrier.
Steve had a rough time against Georgia, and it's one reason that he was never willing to say that he was deserving of all great honors, that he said, I never won a conference championship because of Georgia.
Super Steve had been stopped by the Dogs for the second time in his tenure. But in that time, he'd set a higher standard for the rivalry. Heisman Trophy notwithstanding, he would always have haunting memories of his 2 losses to Georgia.
I don't think this is a true story, but when Spurrier was trying on a specially made tuxedo to get the award, the Heisman Award, the tailor said, "Stand still." And Spurrier ran out of the room. He thought he had said Stanfield.
The 1967 Gators had lost 12 starters from the previous year's squad, but they had some surprises in store for the favored Bulldogs in a quarterback called the Blade, a kicker named the Shade Tree, and a wondrous wide receiver known as Spider-Man.
I certainly recall the 1967 game. It was a great game all the way through.
The first period belonged to Georgia. Key runs by halfback Kent Lawrence and fullback Ronnie Jenkins gave the Bulldogs an early 6-0 lead. Bill Stanfield and the Bulldogs D stonewalled the Gators. And by the beginning of the second quarter, Georgia was cruising with a 9-0 lead. But then the Blade, Larry Rentz, began shredding the Dogs' vaunted secondary, finding Spider-Man Richard Trapp with precision passing. With their team ahead 16-7, Georgia fans were breathing easier, but Rentz and Trapp changed all that with 6.5 minutes to play.
I was wide receiver. I ran a little curl pattern in about the 48-yard line, I think it was, on our 48-yard line.
Rentz passed to Trapp, who twisted and turned, sidestepped and sprinted 52 heart-stopping yards to pay dirt.
You have to see it to believe it. I think 6 players missed him, and that was a good Georgia defensive football team, too.
It was a run that seems to get better over the years, quite frankly, but it was a run that I started out in the middle of the field, got away from a few people, ended up on the sideline, and ended up scoring on it. And it seemed like I got away from an awful lot of Georgia players at the time. Keith Jackson was the announcer, and at the time, he said it was the greatest run he had ever seen.
Georgia failed to move on its next series, and the Gators got the ball back. Trailing by 2, the orange and blue moved to the Georgia 14, where the Dogs dug in. Ray Graves turned to place kicker Wayne Shade Tree Barfield from Albany, Georgia, to kick the winning field goal with 29 seconds left. Barfield wrote his name proudly into the annals of rivalry history with a perfect kick.
I was at a restaurant, sitting in a bar, having a drink, And a gentleman sat down beside me and we started talking. And that talk got around to the Georgia-Florida football game. And I told him that I played in it. And he asked me who I was. And I told him who I was. And the next thing I know, he cold cocks me. And it just hits me. I fall off the bar stool. He helps me up. Sits me down on the stool again. He said, Richard, I'm just extremely sorry that I did that. But when you made that run, I was sitting in the stands that day. And he said, I promised my wife that if I ever met Richard Trapp, I would hit him in the mouth.
A turbulent decade was coming to a close. In '68, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. In '69, men walked on the moon. And in Woodstock, New York, 400,000 shared a weekend of music, peace, and love. In Washington, 300,000 protested the war in Vietnam. And for the first time in 39 years, nobody won the Florida-Georgia game in Jacksonville. It ended in an unlucky tie, 13-13. Florida opened the 1970s with a new head coach, Doug Dickey, who had quarterbacked the Gators to victories over Georgia in '52 and '53. Dickey promptly set the tone for his new reign with a 24-17 upset of the heavily favored Bulldogs. A scrappy defensive lineman, Jack Youngblood, stole the fumble, stopping the surging Dogs near the goal line.
I believe that our back, Ricky Lake, had the ball. And Jack Youngblood was just very nasty. He was so nasty that he took the ball away from our back. And when the official got there, Jack had it. And not only did that stop us from scoring a touchdown, but then Barry Alvarez and Reeves, the quarterback, then took off and threw 2 touchdown passes right at the fourth quarter to beat us. And that's another 2 names that have given me ulcers over the years.
The Dickey-Dooley battles in the '70s served to intensify the rivalry even more. Grudge match blowouts and single-digit squeakers fueled the Jacksonville Fanatics with equal fervor. In '75, Dickey's dream of an SEC championship for his alma mater suddenly seemed attainable. But Dooley and his 6-2 Bulldogs had some offensive tricks up their sleeve. With 3 minutes, 42 seconds left in the game, quarterback Ray Goff handed off to Richard Appleby on an end around.
Richard Appleby had been running several times on the end around, and the side back would come up and stop him for a short gain. But late in the game, he set it up perfectly. They called it again. And this time the side back came up to throw him for another loss, but Appleby suddenly stopped, and Gene Washington was wide open. And Appleby hurled the ball down to him on the 80-yard pass to win the ball game. That was a memorable play.
That was with about a little over 2 minutes left, and as soon as we scored and went ahead, I thought to myself, oh, we've scored maybe too soon. And Florida, with a great offensive team, came roaring back down the field, and fortunately they fumbled the football and we recovered it and won the game.
Georgia dominated the '70s with 7 wins to Florida's 3. But more significant for both teams, the SEC had grown up, and the Georgia-Florida rivalry helped put the conference on the map. As the new decade opened, a young tailback in Wrightsville, Georgia was graduating from high school. He would leave an indelible mark on the rivalry.
We used to beat on
Quarterback Wayne Peace was back too, and he put the Gators in front with a 54-yard strike to Steve Miller early in the second quarter. Then an unlikely Herschel Walker miscue. He bobbled the ensuing kickoff and ran it out of the end zone to the 2. A turnover set the stage for another Florida score. Suddenly the Bulldogs were down by 14-0.
I made such a big mistake, and this is serious stuff here. So it's time to get busy. You got to play here. So the whole game was like, I need to make up for that kickoff.
And make it up he did. It was the time for Herschel Walker to get busy. Ballou connected with Walker on 2 touchdown passes. On the ground, number 34 rushed for 192 yards, carrying the ball 47 times. A series record for 2 more touchdowns. The sensational sophomore saved the best for last.
I think that drive the close in the fourth quarter was a pivoting point also because we showed a lot of heart. It was tough. You know, we may have got 4 yards here and 3 yards there, but we kept pounding that ball.
Georgia's final drive was nothing short of an offensive masterpiece, with Herschel Walker at its center. Walker is the best I've ever seen, said Florida head coach Charlie Pell. We hit him with everything we had, and he just kept coming back. The drive covered 93 yards. Walker accounted for 64. 17 plays took almost 8 minutes off the clock. Walker carried 11 times, breaking loose for runs of 13, 18, 9, and 8. He supplied 4 first downs to keep the drive alive, and his leap into the end zone capped a brilliant display of offensive execution.
That leap was, I had to get up a little bit to do that.
It was a leap into the Georgia-Florida record books for Herschel Walker. And the Georgia running back was only a sophomore. In '82, the Bulldogs were undefeated coming into Jacksonville with an eye on the national prize. Herschel Walker was up to the task of beating down on the Florida defense again. Gator fans just wanted to take a bite out of Walker's onslaught.
We were just clicking on all cylinders that day because we came out, we were ready to play. And I think we had young guys that had matured up also. We've been watching that Florida-Georgia rivalry for a long time. So everyone knew that if you were going to get notoriety, you're getting in that game.
Walker made it look easy, rushing for 219 yards and 3 touchdowns in only 3 quarters of football. It seemed everywhere you turned, Herschel Walker was shedding tacklers and gaining yardage in a 44-0 blowout.
He could have set maybe an all-time rushing record in one game. But we had beaten Florida pretty soundly by the end of the third quarter. We still had Auburn to play the next week, and I was not going to let him go out and get hurt.
Georgia finished another perfect regular season, accepting another trip to the Sugar Bowl for the national championship. They lost to Penn State 27-23. But Walker would take the Heisman Trophy back to Athens.
Herschel was an impact ball player. By that I mean he's the type of guy who can beat you anytime he got the ball. He majored in running with the football, and that's all he did, see? And that's all he had to do.
In 1983, another Georgia win at 6 in a row in Jacksonville. But the Gators were getting closer. Herschel Walker had jumped to the USFL, and the difference was noticeable. Final score, Georgia 10, Florida 9. The '84 Gators were a surprise even to themselves. The overachievers of Coach Galen Hall had discovered an unheralded walk-on quarterback from Mayo, Florida. Kerwin Bell proved he was destined to break the 6-game Georgia win streak. Florida led 17-0 after 3 quarters. But how to deal with those late-game Bulldog surges?
A lot of our seniors and veteran players were starting to say, you could hear the rumblings on the sideline, oh no, here they come. And they drove down to the 4-yard line, and our defense then on 4 straight downs kept them out of the end zone. It was one of the greatest goal line stands our defense has ever had here.
That goal line stand set the stage for Bell to make series history with a Florida wide receiver named Ricky Nattiel.
I looked to the sideline and Galen Hall signals in a go route, which is a 5-step, throw it up deep to Ricky or my other receiver on the other side. And I had to ask him to give it to me again because I just couldn't believe that he was calling for a deep route at that time.
From his own end zone, Bell threw a perfect strike to Ricky Nattiel, who cruised unchallenged down the sideline for a 96-yard touchdown, a rivalry record. The Jacksonville jinx had been broken.
That really then turned the University of Florida's program around, I think, as far as the Florida-Georgia rivalry was concerned.
Florida was #1 in the country. They had reached that height. They were undefeated, riding high. They were heavily favored in the football game.
If you line Georgia up in gym shorts and Florida up in gym shorts, you would have said Florida's going to beat dogs. There's no way around it.
We had seen Georgia. I know a lot of our players had seen Georgia play on TV, and they just didn't look very athletic at all. Didn't look very talented at all.
And they were favored, I think, about by 17 points.
We'll go up to Jacksonville, and they put it on us.
1985 Gator invincibility looked decidedly shaky from the start. The Georgia defense wasn't impressed with Kerwin Bell's impressive stats. Linebacker Greg Muddy Waters spent the afternoon harassing Bell in the Gator backfield. The Dogs sacked Bell, and they intercepted him. And then they rang Florida's bell with a staggering offensive output, led by Keith Henderson and Tim Worley. First, Henderson took off on a 76-yard run. Then late in the game, Worley nailed the coffin shut with an 89-yard marathon into the end zone. Before a record crowd of 82,350 in the Gator Bowl, Florida's #1 ranking and bid for another SEC title were trampled by Georgia's running game.
We were more talented than they were that day, but they came ready to play, and Coach Dooley had them ready. They played above their heads, I believe, that day.
And we just went out and played hard, made no mistakes. That was one of the greatest victories that I can ever remember.
It was a great win, a great upset, and a great moment in Georgia football history.
When the dust settled in Jacksonville, Dooley's Dogs had notched one of their finest upsets, 24-3. Vince Dooley retired in 1988 with 6 SEC titles, 1 national championship, 20 bowl appearances, and a 17-7-1 record against Florida. But the favored son returns to the Sunshine State, and the rivalry gets a Florida tan.
Prior to 1990, we had only scored 30 points on Georgia twice. We were really struggling against the Dogs, particularly mentally, in our attitude toward our chances to win.
2 quarterbacks arrived in Gainesville in 1990, and the tide of the rivalry's history would turn toward the Sunshine State. One was Shane Matthews. The other was a Heisman Trophy winner and former Gator superstar returning as head coach, Steve Spurrier.
Florida has always been loaded with great athletes. Sometimes they were not always as organized as I thought that they should be. But Steve brought a great organization and a great ability to get a team up, particularly for the game with Georgia.
Steve Spurrier brought an intense passion for beating Georgia, and dating back to his playing days, for when he felt that the Gators didn't beat Georgia and lost out a chance at an SEC championship.
So as a coach, he really came back here and made it a priority that we were going to beat the Georgia Bulldogs in this great game.
Steve came in and sold the team and the fans that there's no excuse for not being able to beat Georgia. The game's played in the state of Florida, the stadium named the Gator Bowl. They have to fly down there, we take a bus. Everything's to our advantage.
I always compared it to as if we had to go play Georgia in a stadium called the Bulldog Bowl. And they said, well, that'd be ridiculous going up there and playing Georgia every year in Atlanta. I said, well, that's what they do. They come down here and kick our butts in Jacksonville. So we mentally started believing this was much more of a home game for the Gators than Bulldogs. And certainly it turned out that way, I think, through the 90s.
Spurrier took up the Georgia gauntlet in 1990, and his born-again Gators made a lasting impression on the fans from the Peach State. Shane Matthews completed 26 of 39 passes without an interception for 344 yards and 3 touchdowns.
Shane played wonderfully well in the Georgia game each year.
Matthews hooked up with his receivers Ernie Mills, Terry Barber, and Kirk Kirkpatrick with Spurrier-like efficiency.
Matthews had 3 straight games against Georgia. 92-92, he won all 3 of them. He averaged 316 yards a game passing.
He had about 10 or 11 touchdown passes and no interceptions. So he was fantastic.
He was Florida's answer to Herschel Walker in the series.
Spurrier shocked the Bulldogs with an overpowering offensive and defensive array. Florida vented 2 decades of frustration and Georgia domination in one afternoon with a 38-7 trouncing.
We got off to a good start, winning a couple in a row, not getting upset. And then eventually, like anything, if you beat somebody over and over again, they lose their confidence. And so many times, Georgia didn't play well against us. They fumble, drop balls. They do things to get themselves beat. Sometimes you press when somebody's beating you so many times. Sometimes you try too hard. And I think that's what happened to Georgia a little bit after we were able to win so many times against them.
Georgia was favored in the game. SEC championship was still there for the taking for both schools. They had Eric Zaire quarterback, and it was an absolute monsoon of a rain.
And the Gators had a young quarterback named Danny Werfel who really couldn't get his hands on that ball to grip it well enough, and he struggled and told Steve that he couldn't really throw the ball that well. He said, well, we'll get somebody in that can.
Steve Spurrier replaced Danny Werfel with Terry Dean, and the Gator offense found its water wing. Dean put radar on his arm and found his receivers through the driving rain.
But it turned out it was a ground game. It was Eric Rett's day. He carried 41 times in that game, and the Gators just grounded out and pounded it out behind Eric Rett.
Gator running back Eric Rett took to the ground like a swamp fox, eating up huge chunks of real estate. 183 yards and 2 touchdowns on the day. And then the Bulldogs staged one of their typical second-half surges on quarterback Eric Zaire's passing. A late field goal brought the Dogs to within 1, and Georgia picked up the scent of an upset.
They got a free play at the end. Referee called interference in the end zone on the last play of the game. I think Zaire threw the ball up in the stand somewhere, and they called interference. They got another shot at it. That was a game that I had to sort of go public and talk about the referee. Every time I'd say something, the referee would even off, and it would be fine. But that was a game that one of the SEC refs definitely tried to give Georgia a chance to beat us, giving them an extra play.
In the 3 years following 1993's monsoon game, Danny Werfel would set a new standard for Florida quarterbacks with school passing records, 3 SEC titles, and in 1997 a national championship. That same year, Werfel would become the second Florida quarterback to win the Heisman Trophy. Spurrier's offensive strategy was a playbook of ingenious choreography. And Danny Werfel, the mentor, had found the perfect student to implement it. And it changed the course of Florida football in the 1990s. Spurrier had brought national recognition to Florida football as a Heisman Trophy winning quarterback. And his return to Florida as a coach was no less rewarding. Beating the Georgia Bulldogs 11 times in 12 contests and winning the national championship that eluded him as a player.
The Georgia fans got to a point where they hated Spurrier, but Spurrier was a good coach, and he had a tremendous ability for setting up a good game plan.
Coach Spurrier really changed the way the Southeastern Conference plays football.
For years, it was a defensive smash mouth league, and he came in and threw the football and had more balance, and he changed the game quite a bit.
He is certainly recognized as one of the top offensive coaches in America, and that's his thinking, that make the defensive think and try to take care of their weaknesses and put pressure on them.
Oh, it's always a special moment for all Florida Gators that have been to that game so many times over the years, because we've left with our heads down, and it's time the Gators leave with their heads high, singing "It's great to be a Florida Gator."